as a PhD student, and PhD programs differ. So if you've got a friend in one, you can ask them specifically. But in my PhD program, I have to take what is known as a comprehensive exam. And I also have to write and defend a dissertation. So my comprehensive exam is coming up in January. Fingers crossed that I pass. Oh my gosh, I'm really hoping that I pass. And in order to pass the comprehensive exam, it requires a lot of studying and understanding of material. So over the last many months, I have been gearing up for this exam. And in reading through the material for the exam, I'm someone who I like to understand, kind of like the origin story of something. Yes, I do love Marvel movies. I love the Disney stuff where you see the story and then the story is so popular that people then say, well, what's the origin of that character? That is how my brain works when I hear something. And I often think, what is the origin of that? So that's what I'm going to share with you today, my conclusion about where the field of public administration, modern public administration, begins. And it's interesting because it does connect with the United States, it connects with our history, and it connects with what's happening right now today in our world, and questions that I think each one of us need to ask ourselves. Now, again, there really is not a right or wrong answer to these questions, but there are definitely opinions to these questions. And I'm guessing you've got an opinion. So let's get going. Did you know that the modern field of public administration basically starts with a shooting? So today I'm going to connect some dots between a few big moments you maybe heard about in civics class and then never thought about again. One of those is the spoils system. Okay, to clarify, I didn't actually take a civics class in high school. I took a history class, and this is where I would have learned about some of these things. But some of this stuff in the United States, I'm going to get into it in a moment, takes place in a moment in time where what I'm going to tell you is often not talked about in a history class. And I can tell you that from my own personal experience because I've been a history teacher. And history, as you know, there's so many things about that happen in moments. And so you really do have to pick out what is it that we want these students to take away? What is it that I want to take away from this moment? So I'm going to open a window into a moment in time that you may have not heard of or been aware of, but you might find interesting. So we're going to talk about the spoils system, the assassination of President James Garfield. Did you know that we even had a president in the United States named James Garfield? We did. He was in the late 1800s and he was not president for very long. We have the Pendleton Act of 1883. And then Woodrow Wilson, he was also a U.S. president, but he, for me in the field of public administration and for all the scholars in this field, he is noted as kind of the father of the field of public administration because when he was a student, master's student at the Johns Hopkins University, this is when he writes this article that is this kind of foundation piece. And then I'm going to fast forward to right now with what's happening on the national stage with something that's called the schedule policy career. And this is a live debate about whether the United States is drifting back towards a kind of modern spoils system where loyalty to the president matters more than neutral expertise in government. So, in other words, how did a president getting shot, a Reform Act, and an academic article from the 1800s create the system of government workers we have today? And are we quietly undoing that? And is that quiet undoing, is that a good thing for us? Or is that sending us in a direction that we don't want? So again, talking about the spoils system, the assassination of President Garfield, why the Pendleton Act and Wilson's essay are like the origin story for public administration. And then what's at stake with modern efforts to reclassify tens of thousands of federal jobs into a category that looks a lot like patronage logic in new clothes. Or is it reclassifying tens of thousands of federal jobs into a category that looks a lot like trying to make sure that it is easier to run a government without so many restrictions on the hiring and firing or letting go process? You get to decide that. So I'm not here to tell you which part of this story is good or bad. I just want to ask this: what kind of government do you want? Do you want run by professionals, one run by loyalists, or some mix of both? All right, so let's jump in. So again, did you know the modern field of public administration basically starts with a shooting? Now, this takes us to, I do want to define a couple of things, because I know some people are like, what is that even? So first, I'm going to be talking about the spoils system, which also has the phrase of patronage. Now, the spoils system is where jobs are rewarded for political support rather than merit. And what are we talking about for merit? For merit, that means your qualifications for having the job. And in the world that we live in, I like it when people have jobs based on how qualified they are. So for example, I go to get my hair done. I want to make sure that the gal who's cutting my hair is not just besties with the owner, that she actually knows how to cut my hair because she's gone to school and she's qualified to do that. When I go get my car taken care of, I want to make sure that the people who are going to change the oil, who are going to, fix the AC system if it goes out, they're qualified to do that. I want to make sure that when I go to the doctor, the person who's drawing my blood, again, is qualified to do that. Now, some of these things are trainable jobs just in terms of like on-the-job training and you get it. And there's other ones where I think, oh no, it's really important that we have expertise in that field. So this is kind of where that comes from. And so that's what the spoils system is. All right. So the spoils system begins when we're talking about the United States and we're talking about the spoils system. What this refers to is that when a man becomes a president, that he then appoints people to specific jobs based on their patronage to him, like how much they have been supporting him, and that type of offering, that type of appointment. And that does happen in some degree, but this was happening quite frequently throughout the beginning. Now, this starts with George Washington and appointing his Federalists. George Washington promised after he became president, that he would appoint, quote, the most qualified. Actually, I don't know why I'm quoting that. Not that he actually said that. It's quoted here for my notes, the most qualified. But most jobs still went to his Federalist allies. Thomas Jefferson comes in, and then he replaces all these high-ranking Federalists with his own party in 1801. Those were the Democrat Republicans. So it's a system that, when we talk about loyalists and patronage, it starts from the very beginning. But it really becomes more of federal policy when Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829. Now, just for kind of historical markers here, we win. I'm sure you guys know this. We declare independence in 1776. The Constitution is written in 1787, and it's ratified 2 years later. So then Andrew Jackson, when he becomes president in 1829, this is basically 40 years later. So 40 years into the official United States, Andrew Jackson kind of solidifies the spoils system that has been more of an informal practice for decades. And he makes patronage more systematic. He swept out many of President Quincy Adams' appointees, and he replaces them with his campaign loyalists. And he called it rotation in office to justify it as a democratic refresh. But his patronage really, it goes further and extends down to even lower level positions, not just cabinet level roles. And the famous phrase, "to the victor belongs the spoils," there's a senator in 1832 who defends Jackson, and he says, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemies," which becomes the label for the whole system, the spoils system. And this really is a phrase that kind of captures Andrew Jackson's presidency. So, and the spoils system logic is this: we won, we get the jobs, we get the money and the power. The challenge is this: the argument can be made that the spoils system leads to corruption. There's scandalous appointments, and back in the day, there's corrupt custom collectors, there's unqualified friends in these positions, and a flood of job seekers descending on Washington after elections. I remember not that long ago, I was at about a year ago, I was at Ellis Island, and I was reading about some of the history of the people who were running Ellis Island. And it was really obvious to me that some of these individuals were appointed, and they're appointed based on the fact that they were friends with so-and-so in power. And some of the individuals appointed to run Ellis Island, from my perspective, were terrible individuals, and they were mean and horrible to immigrants who were coming in. And there were some who did a far better job at running that. So it's interesting. And yeah, I think the argument can be made that there were some very scandalous appointments. So imagine every single election means clearing out not just cabinet secretaries, but postmasters, custom officers, mid-level staff, and replacing them with whoever knocked the most doors. That's the spoils system. So then we go 50 years later. So 50 more years into the United States, there's a guy by the name of James Garfield who's elected president. He becomes the 20th president, and he's in office for not very long. And this is kind of when he's in office. Now, these are big themes during this time of American history. This is the end of the Reconstruction. This is the rise of segregation. This is the Spanish-American War. There are significant technological advancements, and this is this is the period of continuation of European imperialism and major scientific discoveries. There's a lot of things going on in the world at this point, and so what I'm about to tell you next really isn't something necessarily that's highlighted, which is why when I ask people how many presidents were assassinated, you often get 2. Maybe 3? Well, the answer is 4. The United States actually had 4 presidents that were assassinated. Everyone knows, President Lincoln, and everyone thinks of JFK. But the 2 that are very forgettable, in part because we don't talk about them much, in part because they didn't die instantly. One is President McKinley, who dies from a bullet wound later. He dies from gangrene from the bullet wound, still counts as being shot and killed. And then the one that I'm going to tell you about, President Garfield, who he gets shot and he dies 80 days later from this shot. So what happens is this guy by the name of Charles Guiteau, he's an unsuccessful lawyer, he's unstable, and he's deeply committed to the patronage logic. He loves it. He gives a few speeches for Garfield as Garfield's running for election, and Charles Guiteau is convinced he was owed an ambassadorship. He wanted to become the ambassador to Austria. And he wrote Garfield invoking the first come, first serve logic. And he argues that he should get this job because he supported Garfield in his election and helping him win. Now, I don't know that Garfield actually saw the letter or not, but Charles Guiteau is this unhinged supporter. And on July 2nd, 1881, Guiteau shoots Garfield because he did not get the appointment that he wanted. And Garfield dies 80 days later from an infection complication to this shot. And the public reaction is this. This is not just inefficient. This is deadly. And by this, they mean the spoils system. And I'm going to get into it more in an upcoming conversation that I'm going to have with Representative Ted Hill about a law that was passed just during this 2025 legislative session. But one way in looking at how laws get passed is through this lens of the multiple streams theory. And basically, this theory says that there are three streams. There's the problem stream, kind of this focusing event. There's the policy, where the experts and the analysts and the academics, they come together with this the actual language. And then there are the political factors, the political climate, the national mood, public opinion. And when these three things come together, a policy window opens. And this is the opportunity to get a bill passed or an act passed. And so President Garfield dying is when this policy window opens. It's when the problem, which is a president getting shot, this is the focusing act. And so this is then when the system begins to change and the legislature says, we agree, this actually isn't okay. The president agrees, this isn't okay. The system that we have has not been serving us. Enough people agree with that premise that the Pendleton Act of 1883 is passed. So what is like slightly ironic, and I want to share these ironic things because I feel like we see them all the time in history, where someone does something and then X amount of time later, they do the exact opposite thing. So President Chester A. Arthur, he becomes president after Garfield dies, and he's the one that signs the Pendleton Act of 1883. What's ironic about it is that he really is the poster child for the patronage machine. He really enjoys the system so much that actually while he's working at the New York's Custom House, he gets fired by Rutherford B. Hayes for giving out too many patronage jobs. And it's interesting, Rutherford B. Hayes even becomes president later in the timeline too. So sorry, I might be sharing too many fun historical facts, like interesting historical facts that you're going, Alexis, this doesn't matter. I'm so sorry. Okay. So basically, Charles Guiteau was not an aberration. He was the dark, logical endpoint of a system where loyalty was the main qualification for public office. And this is where the Pendleton Act of 1883 is signed. And I argue this is the birth of modern administration. So, what did the act do? The Pendleton Act mandates that federal jobs be awarded based on merit and exam performances, not political ties, and it creates the Civil Service Commission. Now, yes, I would love to see what those exams looked like. We don't have those today, but they required open competitive exams for certain federal jobs. And it made it illegal to fire or demote covered employees for political reasons. And that particular one actually that's where you'll hear people discuss that it's become a problem, that in some measure, it's become too hard to fire or demote specific covered employees for political reasons. And then the Pendleton Act, this one I thought, if you go in and you look at bills or historical things, the fascinating things get slipped in. So this bill explicitly targeted cronyism, nepotism, and even rules against chronic alcohol abuse. That is prohibited in this bill. So the scope of this initially only covers about 10% of the federal workforce, meaning that 14,000 employees out of 133,000 employees, those are the ones that are covered by this act. So the early coverage was just basically Washington-based jobs, large post office, and custom houses. The short term was that the patronage jobs actually increased even after the Pendleton Act. And from 1883 to 1901, patronage positions actually grew from 118,000 to 150,000. The Pendleton Act did not instantly end the spoils system, but it built a competing track that gradually expanded. Now, again, this gradually expanded point, this is where people get frustrated because the argument is that like too many federal government jobs are protected by this act, by not being able to shift and move different things around in government. So the long term of this act is that it sets the foundation for a professional merit-based bureaucracy. And over time, presidents used their authority to reclassify more jobs into the merit system. And by the early 20th century, a large share of positions were covered. So Pendleton did not flip a switch that killed the spoils system overnight. It created a small island of merit in a sea of patronage, an island that slowly grew. This then this sets the stage really for the Woodrow Wilson 1887 article, which is called The Study of Administration. And this is what, like in the field of public administration, this is what people refer to as this foundation article. When I was looking into the history of this, and it was when I read the article, I came away with my own opinions on it, what I believe Wilson was trying to articulate in this article. One of the questions that I had, though, was, he was a student at the Johns Hopkins University. Why did he write this article? That was always kind of like at the foundation, like, why did he write this article? And when I was looking through the historical timeline, I saw the Pendleton Act of 1883, and I went, oh my gosh, this is why he wrote that article, because here we have the beginning, this kind of moment in history where they are saying we need to have a merit-based system of employees within the government. And so then Wilson comes along 5 years later, and his article is published about the study of administration. And this article really separates out the premise of politics and the premise of the field of administration, and that the running of government is a field of study, and that field of study is separate from politics. They cross over, they interact, they do all sorts of things, but it is a separate field to understand that whole entity. And so this then, his essay is written, and he argues that administration should be studied scientifically. This is where we have efficiency and management and organization and why people would work for the government anyways. This is not just politics and election. This is a scientific field of study. He makes the foundation arguments for that. And traditional public administration textbooks treats Wilson's article as this founding of this academic discipline, especially for introducing this politics administration distinction and calling for the scientific study of administration. Now, I'm not going to really dive into some of these things, but basically you might hear the phrase politics administration dichotomy. And really, Wilson is just differentiating these two domains: politics, deciding what government should do, and administration is carrying out those decisions. Now, the nuance is he doesn't say that they're not interacting or that real life is not messy, but rather they are distinct enough that each deserves its own theories, research, and professional standards. And many scholars critique this strict dichotomy, but they still acknowledge that Wilson's key role is carving out public administration as its own field, separate from political theory. And the sequence is this: Pendleton gets passed in 1883, and it creates a professional administrative class. 5 years later, Wilson, in his article, creates the idea that this class and its work deserve a systematic study. And then, During the progressive era, which is those early years of the 1900s, they build management, they build budgeting, scientific management. So that's where this timeline comes. So Wilson isn't just saying politics and administration live in separate universes. He's saying we need to understand them as distinct fields of inquiry with different questions, methods, and skills. And I argue that he's saying this because of the Pendleton Act of 1883, because that in that moment in time, all these streams came together, the problem making it to the agenda, the policy itself, the written word, and what that could look like in government, and then the political climate of that time. They all opened to create this opportunity. And as that opened, this government management was formed and this opportunity came. I find it super fascinating, this sequential moments, and then what we have today, because based on what was written in that act, it allowed a president to create a specific classification within the government. And I noted earlier that classification has grown. And that classification, in large measure, is what is being fought against today. And that fight has gotten pretty messy and challenging and hard. And we see it play out in the news and in the media. And this is why I have friends who say, I hate politics because it becomes so annoying and messy. And what is actually true? What's actually happening? I'm getting sound bites and facts interladen with opinions and muddled with garbage. I don't really know what's happening. And so this is why I think there are sources out there that say, what's the origin of this? Where is this coming from? Let me separate out all these different things. And so for me, this is what I've done in my mind for this moment. So we have reform in the late 1800s, and that led to the growth, the expansion of a government workforce, but it also led to it's to this current moment today has led to fragmentation. So during the 20th century, they're built out this professional civil service. More positions are brought under merit rules, and new laws reinforce political neutrality. There's the Civil Service Reform Act in the 1970s. There is at a time, there was this Professional Administrative Careers exam. It was called PACE, was a general entry-level exam for white-collar federal workers. And people within my generation wouldn't know this just in general, because after a period of time, these different exams were eliminated. And one in particular was eliminated in 1981 for being racially discriminatory. And so ultimately what happens is agencies within the government pivot to more of a patchwork of hiring processes. Some have some type of exams or making sure that people understand what they're doing. There's special programs, there are alternative hiring authorities. And this is how we end up with today's fragmented, complex personnel system. And this is where you'll hear people talk about frustration, about wanting to make change or wanting to do this and that. And how do we make sure that change isn't just part of a patronage or spoils system? How do we make sure that people are protected from political elections and people coming in and wanting to wipe out an entire agency? These are questions that this is what we're grappling with today in 2025 and 2026. So if Pendleton birthed the merit system, then there were things that happened in modern day history that gave us the version we live with today. So merit-based in theory, but now we're decentralized, it's complex, and often confusing in practice. So I want to kind of share or describe the structural changes, and then I'm going to offer some things to think about. So today, with the election of President Trump, there have been a lot of executive orders. Now, over the years, more presidents have used executive orders throughout their time. And what's interesting is that when I look at history, I see that a president over the many, many decades has been given or has taken more power, more opportunity to be in control. So during President Trump's first term in 2020, he creates this new category for policy influencing positions, basically positions within government that have the possibility of influencing policy that impact all of our lives. And the goal of what was known as Schedule F was to reclassify potentially tens of thousands of civil servants into an expected service category with fewer protections, meaning they're easier to fire. This Schedule F was never fully implemented. Biden revoked it in January of 21, explicitly invoking the Pendleton tradition and warning that it undermines the merit system. Now we're in the second Trump administration. This is 2025. And early on, the original Schedule F comes out with a new name and additional amendments, and it's called Schedule Policy /Career, but it's reviving the core idea. And there's basically news and analyses estimate that tens of thousands of positions are candidates for reclassifications into at-will-like roles. And this is when agencies begin notifying employees that they will be reclassified and more easily removed. And so just kind of understanding all of those different things. Again, this 2020 President Trump, he creates this new category of federal jobs called Schedule F. And these were career positions that influence policy. They're analysts, attorneys, economists, managers, people who help shape how agencies carry out the law. And under Schedule F, these employees could be hired and fired more easily because they would lose many of those civil service protections that normally prevent political firings. And the order was revoked in 21, and in 25, Trump brought it back and renamed it Schedule Policy Career. And the idea is the same: move tens of thousands of policy influencing career staff into a category where they can be replaced quickly with far fewer protections. And this matters because these actions push against the protections created by the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. Pendleton was passed, again, after Garfield assassination and was designed to end the spoils system by ensuring that federal employees are hired based on merit, not political loyalty. Its whole purpose was to create a stable, professional civil service that serves the public no matter which party wins an election. And the Schedule Policy Career goes in the opposite direction, and it makes it easier for political leaders to remove career experts in policy shaping roles and replace them with people who are more politically aligned. Supporters of Schedule Policy Career call this accountability, making sure that individuals who work within government and who have policy influencing roles are accountable to the individuals who are in those political power positions. Critics of the Schedule Policy Career say it reopens the door to a modern spoils system, especially for jobs that influence government policy. So this is the core issue. Should the people who shape federal policy be neutral professionals protected by merit rules, or political appointees in everything but name? So why do some people, individuals, critics, whomever, see this as pre-Pendleton-ish? Well, they see these actions taken today as pre-Pendleton-ish. One, they weaken job protections for career officials and policy roles. It increases presidential partisan control over who stays and who goes. It raises fear of loyalty tests and retaliation for disagreement or whistleblowing. And commentators explicitly tie this to the spoils system and to attempts to overcome what Trump calls the deep state. So you don't have to claim we're literally back in 1828. I don't think that we're literally back in 1828, but the logic of the spoils system to the victor control the jobs is clearly back in the conversation. I think it's a fair thing to be back in the conversation. And I don't think it's something that people need to be afraid of or say, that's not true. These are things that have been a part of the conversation really from the beginning of the United States. The drive to align the federal workforce tightly with one political agenda and to remove civil service protections from policy influencing staff really does echo pre-Pendleton patronage dynamics. So some analysts describe this as a partial return to pre-Pendleton dynamics, not a full repeal of the merit system, but a serious tilt back toward loyalty-based control over the administrative state. Why does this matter? Why does this matter for all of us? Well, public administration is how things actually get done. Think disaster response, Social Security, Medicare, veteran benefits, school lunches, environmental enforcement. Public administration is supposed to be how things get done. And some people feel really great about it, and some people are frustrated about it. What's interesting is that let's take education. It's something I talk about a lot. When people talk about education today, when you ask most people, you say, what do you think about, the education system? People will say, I love my local school. I love it so much. Whether that's elementary, middle, high, people will say, I love my school, but I'm not too keen on what's happening on the state and federal level. And what that means is people love their local school, but they're not hot on the system. They're frustrated with the system. They don't like that. And I think that often happens when we think about when people experience public administration. They have a pretty good experience on a person-to-person local level, but they're frustrated with the system that exists. So why does this matter? The whole Pendleton, Wilson, 140 years of public administration theory is about one core idea. Democracy chooses what government should do. Professional administration ensures it gets done competently, consistently, and fairly. That's what I study. I think it's super interesting, clearly, because I'm studying it. If you've got questions, let me know. Another thing to think about, when you erode merit protections and move towards a spoils system logic, we risk instability, mass turnover with every change in power. Think about, what happened early on in the United States. So instability, we risk incompetence, meaning loyalty is rewarded more than expertise. We risk fear and self-censorship inside agencies. How much should there be? That's a question people need to ask themselves. And that hits regular people long before they ever notice a tweak in a statute. This meaning that what happens in some of these different things, I know that some of you have heard about people who are working for the federal government and they have been let go of their jobs, or they were censored in some way, or they noticed that loyalty was rewarded over expertise. I think that people are starting to notice this. So some of these things come out in research and it's interesting, and I won't dive into those. I find it super fascinating. And then, I like the idea that you don't have to love big government to want competent government. The spoils system gave us loyalty. Pendleton and a century of public administration tried to give us competence. And I think that's a really important component for me when I think about the whole premise of government. I want a competent government, and I want a government that is going to serve us well. And yes, that can be argued. What does well look like? That's where we get lots of different opinions, and that's where we go in and try. It's where we see people try to argue for us to support them or for us to support someone else. So we started out this episode with a pretty wild chain, not so wild to me, but basically early America runs on patronage, and presidents reward friends and loyalists with government jobs. And then 40 years later, under Andrew Jackson, that practice explodes into a full-blown spoils system. To the victor belongs the spoils. 50 years after that, in 1881, a man who thinks he's owed a job shoots President James Garfield, and the country recoils. And so 2 years later, the Pendleton Act starts a slow, uneven shift toward merit-based hiring and a professional civil service. And just a few short years after that, Woodrow Wilson, as a master's student, begins this argument, and then after he argues that administration deserves to be studied on its own terms, not just as politics by another name, and public administration as a field is born. And over 140 years, we build a system that tries to balance democratic control with neutral competence. And so now we're in this moment of schedule policy career. Formally, Schedule F is back on the table, potentially moving, well, not potentially. We know that people have been let go, and they're moving more protected roles into that at-will status. And for me, the fascinating and even unsettling question is, are we watching the arc bend back towards a spoils logic where we win, we get the jobs, becomes the norm again? I don't think the answer is simple. We do want elected leaders to steer policy, but we also rely on a backbone of professionals who can tell the truth, implement the law, and stay in place when power changes hands. So I want to leave you with these questions. How much political control is healthy over the people who actually run the government? What do we lose if expertise and continuity take a back seat to loyalty? And if we are coming full circle, is that a bug in our system or a feature of how polarized democracies behave? So if this episode sparked a thought or made you rethink something you filed away under boring bureaucratic stuff, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on Instagram at the Idaho Lady, or send me a message through the show notes. If you haven't followed yet, hit the follow button on the purple zone on your fave podcast app or YouTube so you don't miss future episodes. And if you found this helpful, leaving a quick review is one of the best ways to show support for the show. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves, take care of your communities, and I'll see you in the next episode. And that's a wrap for today's episode of The Purple Zone. Thanks for being here. If you liked what you heard, leave a review on your fave podcast app or on YouTube. And from me to you, the heart of The Purple Zone says community is where policy comes to life.